Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and today, Dave, one of our pastors, and then a friend, Rick Langer, is joining us. Welcome, Dave. Rick, so glad you're here with me.
Thanks for inviting me. Great to be here.
Yep, glad to be back with you, Autumn.
Before we jump into our podcast conversation for today, I have a question for both of you, and that is, what's on your nightstand? What are you reading right now? So Dave, we'll pitch to you first.
Sure. What I'm reading right now, several different things, but I'm reading a book. It's a biography on Jim Bridger. It's called Jim Bridger, Trailblazer of the American West. He was a mountain man. I think he he explored the Tetons, and a lot of people know a lot of things about him. I know nothing about him. So every chapter is fascinating to me. I know nothing about this person. I know he was a character in The Revenant. And so that's it. That's it. I'm like 3 chapters in. Right now, he is trying to protect, he's 12 years old. He's trying to protect his little sister from imminent death. And he's 12 with a shotgun, and also trying to keep them from starving to death. So anyway, fascinating.
Yeah. Rick, how about you? What are you reading right now?
Well, I have been reading a book by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird called Jesus and the Powers, I believe is the title. But it's been really interesting. So I have an interest in the church's engagement with political things. We'll probably, I'm sure, talk about some of this in the course of events, but that's not a thing I've spent a ton of time on theologically. That wasn't a thing I grew up with. It's a thing I've kind of backed into because of circumstances in the last 10 years. So this has been a really interesting read for me. And one of the things that's really made me sensitive to is how much kind of empires and powerful world empires shape the social background of the Bible. So it could be an Egyptian empire, it could be an Assyrian empire, it could be a Babylonian empire, it could be the Medes and the Persians, it could be the Romans. And as I roll through that list, you probably realize, oh yeah, I do remember all of those from the Bible. And the question to ask is, so do you remember any part of the Bible that isn't attached to one of those social empires and contexts?
Yeah.
And the interesting thing that spins out of that is how politically subversive, a simple phrase like Jesus is Lord might be. Because it isn't just, hey, that's snappy, I'll put it on my bumper sticker. It's, you say that out loud and you are violating the power claim of the person who's not only running your little turf, but the entire empire in which you've been swallowed up. And so it's a really interesting book that way, just in terms of that kind of context of the Bible. So it's been fun. It's been an interesting read.
Yeah. Dave, I think you have read that, right?
Yep.
This is one of the books you and I have. Yeah.
Reviewed it a few months ago for a little writing project. So yeah, I agree. Fascinating, really fascinating little book.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I have mostly been reading books for the podcast.
You're reading a fascinating book by this guy named Rick Langer.
Cool.
Rick Langer called
Maybe
Winsome Conviction.
Buy 12.
I highly suggest it. Everyone listening should buy it. I have truly been reading Winsome Conviction to prepare for today's podcast conversation. Next up on my to-read list, because today's episode will conclude the 5th of 5 author interviews that we had lined up to do on the podcast. And so I'm sure I'll continue reading things for the podcast, as I always do. But the next book on my to-read list, so what I'm just starting, is The Collected Works of Flannery O'Connor. Last year, I read, that maybe Hunter and I both mentioned it in our best reads of the year, but a book about the life of Tim Keller and the influences on his life, the people who kind of shaped him, and by Colin Hansen. And so in that book, they mention Tim Keller's that Flannery O'Connor influenced him in a particular way, and that he mentioned her work repeatedly. And so I reread one of her short stories at that time, and then picked up the book, the collected works. So she was an American writer who wrote 2 novels and then many, I think over 30 short stories. And so I anticipate that in this book, if I have to read a little bit and then set it down to read something else, I'll be able to, because many of them are shorter stories. But I'm excited to get into that. I haven't read really beyond one of her short stories, any of her work. So that's what's on my to read. That's what I'm going to start reading. But we are discussing a book that you, Rick, wrote along with a co-author, Tim. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Is it Muehlhoff?
Tim Muehlhoff. Yep.
Muehlhoff. So the book is called Winsome Conviction. And before we start talking about the content of the book, which will take up the rest of our conversation today, just introduce yourself. Help our listeners get to know you a little bit. So whatever you would like to share with us about your life and your work and what brought you to living in Denver right now, where we could say, hey, come hang out at Fellowship Denver with us for a morning and talk about your book.
Well, I grew up in Colorado, went off to go to seminary in California now 43 years ago. And so I just moved back to Colorado recently and retired from full-time work. I'm still doing things related to my teaching role that I had at Biola University Talbot Seminary in California. But I grew up in a very scientific kind of home. So my dad was a research scientist. My brother was an astrophysicist. I went off and got a chemistry degree up at Colorado State. And that was just the kind of things that we did. But I became a Christian when I was later in high school. I was very active in the Campus Crusade group that was on campus. I went overseas after I graduated. I was planning on going to do PhD work in science because that was like what Langers do, you know. And I ended up going overseas, was in India, had a bit of a Jesus-Damascus road, except it was the Madras Road experience. And so I came back, went to seminary. And then while I was in seminary, I rubbed shoulders with a professor who really encouraged me to think about doing some academic work in philosophy. So I kind of went from a chemistry major to a theology degree, to a philosophy degree. So it's kind of academic drunk driving is what I like to call it. And then I was a pastor for 20 years, and I would teach part-time as an adjunct at University of California, Riverside, teaching philosophy and, you know, some other schools as well. And then I got an opportunity to teach full-time at Biola, and so I did that. And one of the interesting things that happened was this whole weird, convoluted, misguided, swerving across traffic academic life that I had. The role that I had at Biola was helping people think what the Christian faith has to do with every single major we had on campus. So I spent a lot of time working with other faculty, doing what we called integration of faith and learning, but it's really just asking, what does Christian discipleship mean if you're a nurse? What does it mean if you're in business? What does it mean if you're in, one of the sciences or cinema and media arts or all these other kinds of things? So it was a really, weirdly enough, my academic background ended up being perfect preparation where I've spent the last 20 years doing. And at the end of that time, I was teaching a class there at Biola with a friend of mine who's a comm studies professor. And we got to talking about the class we were doing and said, hey, we should write a book that came out of this. So we did, and that book was called Winsome Persuasion. And it was about how the Christian church communicates to the non-Christian world and how we can be more effective in persuading people regarding the Christian faith. So we wrote that book, and I was doing some, you do conferences or retreats or things like that for people. And I would do this with some churches, and because we talked about how do we communicate to a culture who have radically different views on things like gender and sexuality and things like that, and how do we communicate? Well, I'm talking to this, I remember one particular time, a guy who was at a men's retreat, and they had about 90 men, beautiful group, really intergenerational. And the guy I'm talking to was older, probably in his 70s. And he's like, yeah, Rick, all the stuff you're talking about between the church and the world, he says, all that's happening in the pew right here at church between our generations and how differently we see things. And we need to figure out how to communicate with each other. And that became the seed from which Winsome Conviction, the book that we're talking about today, came, is we just realized we have not just tensions with the world, but within the church we have tensions about how we view matters of conviction. And in the church, it can be really, really destructive and divisive. And so the longer I began speaking to people, the more they had a sense that I really need to work on thinking through what does this mean within the church. So that's kind of the story, both of my background and then how I ended up in the middle of writing a book like this.
Now, when you look in the New Testament, turns out that's not really a new phenomenon. Tension
That's correct.
Within the church. And I love how, I know we'll get to sort of breaking down the book, but you start with really a beautiful and honest description of the early church, and that rivalries and divisions and necessary conflicts emerged that caused real, like, forever division. You see all of that in the church, and yet you also see a value of unity that is there as well, and you kind of walk the reader through those tensions. So I love that you didn't just see it in your engagement with the churches today, but when you as a biblical scholar, you showed us, hey, this is an issue that's been in the church since the beginning.
It's funny you even put it that way. You know, you think of the church, early church, relative to what's going on there, and you think of, oh yeah, these are the people who are being fed to lions. You know, they're obviously at odds with the Roman Empire because the Roman Empire is dining on them, you know, or putting their lions are. But that imagery of being torn apart, their flesh being torn apart, Paul uses that exact imagery in Galatians chapter 5 when he's talking about the works of the flesh and the works of the spirit. And says, works of the flesh, be careful. Division and anger and animosity, you'll rip and tear each other. And you can almost see the imagery of martyrdom in the arena being teased out when he says, I'm looking at how we're talking to each other in the church. And you're ripping and tearing, and be careful lest you be devoured by one another. And I'm like, yeah. So I guess you're right, Dave. This is just sort of the 2020 incarnation of that which was going on in 50 AD in the church as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, in chapter 2, you make this point that has surfaced right here in our conversation, that this issue of quarreling within the church, this divisiveness and the danger that accompanies it, the real risk of actually being torn apart that you're just describing, that it's not a new problem, that's what we just mentioned, that it was addressed in the epistles, that Paul talked to the churches about this, the earliest churches, about this very issue, and warned them about how destructive it could be. And then you also mentioned in chapter 2 of the book that it's not a uniquely American or Western issue, that as you've interacted with pastors from various places, that they voice the same concern and notice that quarreling within the church, that this potential for divisiveness can be so destructive. But the title of the book is Winsome Conviction. So how do those two ideas, the issue that you've seen, divisiveness within the church, quarreling within the church, that's the specific word used to address this issue in chapter 2, and then conviction. How do those two ideas, how is this winsome conviction, addressing that issue?
Yeah, so I should probably say kind of at the outset here, if you were to have talked to me 7 or 8 years ago when we were probably first thinking about this book, and we backed into the word winsome for this because we'd written Winsome Persuasion, and this was a follow-up, so it became Winsome Conviction. But winsome is kind of the tack-on thing. Well, fast forward to 2024, I have gotten more flack in the last 2 years about the word winsome because for some reason we hear the word winsome and we think the guy said mushy. And I'm like, this is not a book about mushy conviction. And
it's actually a book about how to have conviction. You're pro-conviction.
I literally, the thing that when I thought of what I was researching, thinking on, when I did think of what I was writing, I was not doing research on how to be winsome. I was doing research and thinking about what does it mean to have well-formed Christian convictions. And once that penny drops, then we can ask the question of how do we communicate them. And I would argue the best word that I want to say for that is I want to communicate them effectively.
Yes.
So if I alienate people, I'm not communicating them effectively. And for some reason in our cultural moment, it feels like in order to be a real person of conviction, I need to kind of slam it in their face or whatever, I've got to be alienating. And that shows the firmness of my conviction. And I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think that has anything to do with whether or not you have a well-formed conviction. And furthermore, I think if you have a well-formed Christian conviction, the consequence of that is that then you have to have a Christian way of communicating that. And we don't get to decide, well, pragmatically, that doesn't work. And I'm like, I don't care if it works pragmatically. If Jesus said we're supposed to be filled with love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, here's my favorite one, gentleness, and self-control, I'm like, okay. If someone says, but that won't work, you don't know what it's like. I've had this conversation with people who, in a political setting, congressmen, and it's like, yeah, that's not the way it is. And I'm like, I don't really care about the way it is. This is actually, believe it or not, a matter of conviction to me. Mm-hmm. And if the Bible says we're supposed to be gentle and kind, and if the number one way that you see people correcting others, Paul constantly tells you to correct others with gentleness. I'm like, how do I get to opt out of that? Well, my convictions prevent me from opting out of that. So I feel obliged. And you can call it winsome if you want. I mean, like I say, we backed into that word. If you don't like winsome, could we call it gentle? Could we call it kind? I don't know. You picked the word. But I'm just saying, as a matter of conviction, I've got to communicate it that way. So, yeah, so you can tell. You pushed the little hot button for me here. I'm processing my pain. But, yeah, that's the story. And it really is a book. I think anyone who would read the book would clearly see it's first and foremost a book about convictions.
Yes.
And then once you're saying, my argument in effect with Tim, as we wrote this, is to say, the easiest way we have to communicate our convictions well is if we have formed them well. Because then we have a bit of we aren't as intimidated, we're not as afraid. When people push back, we don't have to flame at them. But we're saying, yeah, I've thought about that. Or you can even say, wow, I've never thought about that. Thank you, that's helpful, because I've got to think about this, because I'm busy trying to get well-formed convictions.
Well, the term you use is thickening convictions.
Yeah.
And the image that you describe is like, don't think thickening as in hardening, but thickening as in calluses. In other words, if you have a well-formed conviction, you can actually hold it and use it and have like a three-dimensional way of knowing it, where it kind of fits with everything else. Therefore, you can use it in discussion, and it's actually a lot more. It's easier for other people to understand it and appreciate its sort of internal logic if it's thickened. Whereas if it's thin, then a lot of people are self-conscious about it, or they're insecure about it, and there's a lot of this explosion that kind of happens with it. So I love the vision of thickening your convictions, and the stronger they are in that sense, then the more you can kind of describe them and utilize them, and then help people understand them, and then use them to help understand others' convictions as well. Which to me, the chapter on Romans 14 is really important in this whole discussion. That kind of anchors, okay, what's my posture? So here I am in the church, in my fellowship group, and I have a different conviction than someone else in my group. And you, of course, in the book, describe the difference between a theological foundation and how that theology gets expressed in certain actions. And you have a whole rubric for that. But let's just say I'm in my fellowship group, but how I express this theological conviction is different than someone else. What's my posture towards that other person? And then you kind of walk us through Romans 14. Can you give us just a little snapshot of kind of what you do with Romans 14? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah, and in some ways, the heartbeat of the book is exactly this issue in Romans 14, because what Paul does, I think we tend to think about moral matters as being always absolutes, and therefore if we differ on a moral matter, then we're differing about a matter of absolute. The side effect of that is if you are all Christians and say, oh, we all share the same absolutes, so we should never have a moral conflict, a conflict about morality or a conflict about convictions. We can have a conflict about a matter of taste, who do you cheer for, what college do you go to, blah, blah, blah. That's all great. But we would never have a conflict about anything that would be considered a moral issue or a matter of conviction. That, I think, is what's in our head normally. So there's kind of two areas, matters of taste, matters of conviction. What Paul does in Romans 14 is he says there's actually a third thing, what you might call matters of taste on one side, what you might call absolute convictions on another, because Paul absolutely believes in absolute convictions, no question about it. But he says there's also areas that what I would call simply matters of personal conviction. Mm-hmm. And those are not things that you say whatever and who cares about. You're things that you say, no, I'm going to form a conviction about this. But Paul's keen insight is that everyone else in your church might not share the same conviction. They might view it differently, but they're still going to see it as a matter of right and wrong. So the example he gives in Romans 14 is days and diets, roughly speaking. Some people consider all days alike. Some people consider you can eat meat. Others say, no, we won't eat meat because you're not sure if the meat's been sacrificed to an idol. So you have these differences. And Paul takes a whole chapter to unpack that and says, guys, you're going to have those differences. And here's what I want you to do. I don't want you to say, who cares? I says, the point is, it doesn't matter if you agree with your neighbor, but I want you to realize anything that doesn't proceed from faith is sin. I want you to realize that you're not going to give an account to your brother, but you will give an account to Jesus. So he's saying this is absolutely a matter of conviction. But that said, you don't have to agree with your brother. And I want you to live with peace among one another. You don't need to convert each other, but each person needs to develop a conviction because they're going to stand before Jesus and give an account. And the example he's giving is, like I say, is days and diets. And the danger for us as modern Americans is when we hear days and diets, we don't care if you worship on Friday, Saturday, I go to Saturday night, Sunday, you go to Sunday morning service, blah, blah, whatever, who cares? I'm like, guys, this is first century Mediterranean world, and this is the Roman church that's a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. And you tell me where Jesus had the greatest number of conflicts when you read through the Gospels. Or did he have anything that was more problematic for him than what he did in terms of what he ate and who he ate with, or what day he did the things he did on? So to say days and diets, hey, who cares? That's like, what football team do you cheer from? Not to any first century Jew. This was a hugely important issue. But Paul's saying this is an issue about which you're going to stand before Jesus and give an account, but you're not going to account for your brother. I'm not going to give an account for Autumn. I'm not going to give an account for Dave. I'm going to give an account for Rick. So I'm going to form a personal conviction about this, and I will do that to honor Jesus. But this is an area in which Christians can actually disagree. So that's the essence of Romans 14 to me, and it is just pushing apart matters of taste and matters of absolute conviction. Say there's also this whole middle area of personal convictions, and that area is way more important and way bigger than we think. There's a lot of areas that we fight about. In fact, in the church, I was a pastor for 20 years. I don't remember having a battle in our particular church about whether or not Jesus was Lord. We kind of all agreed on that. It was a matter of absolute conviction. But do we fight about things about immigration? Do we fight about things about gun control? Do we fight about all these other things? Oh, yeah. And it's uncanny when you think about it, how many of these areas that we fight about are actually areas that live in this middle ground. And that's the core of this book, is saying, how do we navigate that middle ground?
You described this tendency that we have to take something that is a matter of personal conviction and absolutize it.
Yeah.
turn it into a moral absolute and then assume that it applies to our brother, or that they should perceive it exactly the same way. And I found this description of, you list 4 categories: confessional beliefs, which is something like what you just said, Jesus is Lord. We agree about that.
Right.
Confessional beliefs, moral mandates, core values, and guidelines for conduct, and describe this spectrum. So how our beliefs, I think one word that you use in the book is operationalize. So how these confessional beliefs then get lived out. And in that process of moving from the confessional belief to our practices, that is where we begin to experience disagreement with our brothers and sisters. And so can you use the term conviction spectrum, but as I was thinking through this and realizing how these disagreements form, I thought that was so helpful. So what is that concept, the conviction spectrum? How does that work?
Yeah. So I appreciate you bringing that, and I appreciate you having read and understood that, Anna. That's wonderful. I spend a lot of time when people say, let's back up and talk about this again. So yeah, the idea here is basically, as you put it so well, you have to take this, not an abstract theological belief, but simply, let me just call it a theological belief about human beings bear the image of God. We are made in the image of God. The deity of Christ, the humanity of all people. So all these different theological beliefs that we have, the question is, so how does that matter in actual life? Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by operationalizing, putting it into practice. So it isn't enough to believe right, we need to live right. And when it comes time to live right, we live in really tangible, specific ways. Mm-hmm. So if I'm to love the Lord my God and have no other God before me, what does that mean? Well, I need to worship him. Does that mean you need to worship him on a particular day? Does that mean you need to worship him every week? What do you do with it? Do I worship in a church body? Do I worship in the home? I'm just going, I don't know. All of that isn't all spelled out, but it should be a thing that you can spell out and give a good account of. This is what I mean about a personal conviction. Mm-hmm. There isn't a lot of room for saying, do we worship God? But exactly what does that mean with my church life or things like that? I think there's room for difference on that count. Mm. But in all cases, the goal is faithfulness. Mm. So what you want to do is think about this across the spectrum. What is true theologically? What is commanded? Both of those, broadly speaking, should fit in the category of absolutes. But then you say, what does this absolute mean about a particular circumstance? It's like, well, I don't know. To take the example of human beings made in the image of God, the thing right beside that is the moral mandate that God spells out in Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, that because you're in the image of God, you cannot take a human life. Mm-hmm. The other animals you can eat, not the human beings, okay? So, you have this protected moral mandate that comes from a theological claim. Okay, that's great. Then what does that mean about, can I go to war? Can I fight in a war? And some Christians have looked at that, and because of human beings bearing the image of God, we cannot take human life. And so we have had a 2,000-year history of Christian pacifism as a current within the Christian faith. We have, roughly speaking, that long a history of people talking about just war. And I'm like, those are two different views, but notice neither one of them of saying human beings really aren't in the image of God, and it's really no big deal to take another human life. That whole discussion is born of people who absolutely share those absolutes, both the theological and the moral mandate. Mm-hmm. But they disagree about, how does that work out when you have an Adolf Hitler over here? How does that work out when someone's raping someone in front of you? Yes. What do you do with those things? Mm-hmm. Because they feel that tension. And so usually you formulate your response. We'd like to think we just abstractly reason to the proper viewpoint. In reality, you're a big bucket of past experiences, personal values, your own hurts, your own joys, and those things profoundly color. So I lump that under the category of core values. That's kind of it's a big black box. Sometimes when I present this in groups, I say, let's just call it the black box of conviction making. Because my experiences, my tastes, my passions, all those things mix together and make me say, yeah, I'm going to come out and say I will be a pacifist because I'm quite happy being countercultural and leaving things up to God. Mm-hmm. And another person says, look, God gave us the power to stop certain things. Mm-hmm. And if we don't use it, that's wrong. And I'm a big fan of being faithful to do the things we're called to do. And I'm like, oh, That's part of their black boxes. But what spins out the backside looks really, really different. So that's that process. And again, the goal I'm saying is to think it all the way through. My enemy is what I call the half-baked conviction. And by that, I should call it the half-cooked conviction, because half-baked makes it sound flaky. I'm just saying, no, you haven't thought it all the way through yet. And the best way to think it through is to actually talk with people. Knock it around. Talk to people who disagree. And it'll bake your conviction a little bit more. It'll become more well done. It'll become a little bit more calloused. And by the time you're done with that process, you're like, yeah, I feel like I could stand before Jesus and give an account of my pacifism or my just waricism or whatever that would be, that you have that well cultivated. So that's the process of kind of the conviction spectrum, and think about it as a way of kind of showing your moral work relative to your conviction. You know, back in first grade, you just gave the answer to your math problem, right? Third grade, you learned your multiplication tables. But it wasn't about showing your work. It was just about getting the right answer. And I'm saying convictions are junior high math, where your teacher has that nasty thing where she says, show your work. And if you don't show your work, you don't have the right answer. Even if it's the right answer, it's not the right answer, because you need to show your work. And I would argue the best thing we do in forming our conviction, say, let me go through the discipline of showing the work to myself, and then I can share that process with others. So even when we disagree, we can figure out where we disagree and why, because I've shown my work.
Wow. Well, there's like a twin task you kind of call your readers to. The first is show your work on your convictions. We've talked about that, and you give a process for that. But then the twin task, and you do one at the same time as you're doing the other, is you're learning well. How do I engage someone who has the different conviction, or who has the sort of the opposite of where I'm leaning? What's my posture towards that person? How do I engage with them? Do I cut them out? Do I continue to engage with them, even though their presence in my life might be annoying? Biblically, you kind of help us kind of think through that. I love that you used Paul and Barnabas as sort of a classic early church expression of how you can have, I forget how you use the particular sort of language you use, but they separated but didn't divide.
Yeah.
They didn't become two different things, but they did become two different ministries within the same thing. And then later on, you see sort of their ministries, converging and benefiting from each other. So help us think through, what is the proper posture of a Christian who does now say they take your advice, and they have well-formed convictions. What is their posture towards people who have different convictions, and or maybe people who haven't thought through what they're doing, or you might think they don't have any convictions? Like, what's our posture towards people like that?
Yeah, Dave, as Rick was talking a minute ago, he said, one of the best ways to do that is to talk about it. And my thought was, that can be really hard. And there's a whole section of the book dedicated to doing what Dave is asking you right now. How do we talk about it and communicate with each other, especially where there are areas of difference?
Without getting triggered, without just causing more conflict.
Yes.
Yeah. So, let me be honest. It is. So I will point out that the only way you cook something is by heat. So when I'm saying the best thing is to talk about it, I'm not necessarily assuming that it will always be nice and handy and easy. That said, it can also be incredibly destructive, harmful, and hurtful. So somehow, and again, probably cooking is the right metaphor, right? Because you never say, just put it in the oven. It doesn't matter what temperature. It matters a ton what temperature it is, right? So you want it at a place where it kind of cooks but doesn't burn. In our conversation,
so we're not supposed to be like 3-year-olds with the s'mores. And
you got
putting the marshmallow in the fire for 5 minutes.
It's not really done till it's on fire. You want to figure out that temperature, and I appreciate you pointing that out, Adam, because that's really true. It can be harmful, and that ends up becoming hurtful for conviction formation. So one of the things I really encourage people to do is listen first as much as possible. So you're talking to a person and you're suddenly going, wait, you voted for who? Or, you're a pastor, whatever it is, you're in favor of tearing down all borders. And our thought is, you must be crazy or you must be evil. Those are the two things that honestly come to mind. You're ignorant. I could throw that one in. Ignorant, crazy, or evil. Yeah, kind of like maybe the combination.
Crazy and evil.
And usually the person you're talking to is actually neither. None of those things. They aren't crazy, they're not evil, and they're not as ignorant as you think they are. In fact, it might be that they've read as many books as you have, just different ones. It might be they've listened to as many podcasts, just different ones. And so the best thing to do is stop and say something like, I've never thought of it that way before. Tell me more. And you can even say, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but clearly it does to you, so talk to me about that. Another thing is to tell them the story, tell the backstories. And we did this, a thing that we did at Biola several times is a thing we called a duologue, where we got professors who were, all professors at Biola, but had differing viewpoints on like big controversial issues. So one of the first ones we did was on why I'm a Christian progressive, why I'm a Christian conservative, politically in terms of voting. Well, as you can imagine, that raises a few hackles. So one of the things we did before we had these discussions is we brought people over. They came over to my house. We had dinner. We sat on the back patio for 3 or 4 hours, and we told the long story of things. And the person who was talking about, who drifted more towards being a Christian progressive, when she talked about this, she says, I grew up in a very conservative Christian home. My dad was an elder and all this stuff, and classic sort of middle class, upper middle class family. And then my dad committed adultery. And mom and dad split up, and suddenly I went from living an upper middle class sort of standard to dad wasn't faithful to pay child support, and we were suddenly on the verge of living on the street. In fact, had I think a season where they lived in the car. And the idea of should we have a robust safety net and welfare program, let me tell you, that made all the difference in the world to me. And she listed 3 or 4 other things that you're like, oh. And does that make her right and the other person wrong? No, because there's another story that this other person can tell, right? But at some point you're like, oh, I get it. When we talk about immigration, I tell the story in the book, but my dad came over on the boat. And he came over without an entry permit. He came over acting like he was the kid of a family who did have an entry permit. He was pretty much in that sense an illegal immigrant. But he was fleeing Nazi Germany, and his mom was Jewish. His mom had been taken away to a concentration camp in the middle of the night, and my dad remembers that. He was about 13 or 14. He had 60 years of nightmares from that event. So Dad came to the U.S., but the U.S. wasn't welcoming Jews from Germany at that time. But he came, and then he had some connections, so he became legalized fairly quickly in that process. But the starting point was an immigration thing. And so when you talk to me about immigration, do you want to know that backstory about me? I would say you probably do. Does that make me right in my feelings about immigration? No, but it certainly makes them understandable. And you may have a radically different experience with immigration, all these kind of things. It gives you a different story, right? So we will process, what does this mean about how open our borders should be or things like that. We're going to process those things differently. And one of the best things to do when you're about to have a conflict over this is to pause and say, tell me the story. Tell me the backstory. When did you first start feeling this way? Are there experiences you had or people who really formed you this way? And suddenly, instead of just hitting each other with the conclusion, we can tell each other the story. And you know how stories are. They kind of open up your heart. They open up the conversation. You can ask people. I mean, when we were having this conversation on the back patio, we're suddenly asking all these questions about this person. We only knew as some woman running around with a PhD, being a professor, and looking like a flaming success in life, right? This is like crazy. And you suddenly realize what the backstory is and why they might see some things differently than you see it today.
You mentioned that after that experience, you then sort of made that be almost a policy. Before you had any like open debate in these duologues, they had to have dinner first.
Yep.
And I kind of think like, what if we were willing to debate someone, or we have a strongly held kind of position that's different than someone, do we equally have as much space and compassion or heart to understand them, or to be, you have in your book, you have a lot of like nice little phrases and one-liners. One is called a cognitive miser, which is like, I'm too stingy to open up my thinking towards having you be any more than what I think you are.
Yeah.
And yet part of the ethical mandate of loving not just our friends and neighbors, but actually loving our enemies. It's like if we're called to die for someone, then you say, shouldn't we also be willing to at least have time to listen to someone?
Yeah.
And I love the how you pair patience and listening with a willingness to engage with someone while not diminishing conviction.
Yes.
But it is a way of understanding and appreciating and actually loving someone. Mm-hmm. Understanding knowledge is a key actually definition of love. And patience with someone is how we express love for each other. So if it's sort of a real practical opportunity to love someone is to listen to them. And that's not the same as diminishing or saying that your conviction is any less or saying that theirs is any more right.
Yeah.
But it is a way of showing love.
Yeah. And as I talk about the book, we use this phrase, achieving disagreement. And we're really prone to say, oh, this person's, LGBTQ, I'm a conservative Christian with traditional sexual ethics. You walk into the room together and you assume you've already achieved disagreement, so to speak. You know what they think, I know what I think. And I'm like, do you really? Do you really? Why don't you listen to their story? And then try and tell their story back in a way that they'd say, yes, you got it. And until you've been able to communicate their viewpoint in a way they nod their head and say, yep, that's what I think, you don't really know what they think. They just told you, no, that's not what I think. So you don't know yet. So you can't disagree with them until you know what they're actually thinking. And we usually don't give them the gift of patience and time enough to listen to them well enough to say, okay, I think I understand what you're saying and particularly feeling about this issue. Let me try and communicate both the content and the feeling I've heard from you. And when you can do that successfully, then you're at a point where you can achieve disagreement. Say, okay, here's the difference.
And ironically, once you achieve disagreement, now you're in a place where real heartfelt persuasion can happen.
Yeah.
Because you've been heard, you've been listened to, and then now it's like, okay, now maybe I'm now interested in hearing your perspective, and let me learn more about this. And it's really amazing that real persuasion and convincing can happen once people feel understood.
Yeah. Well, and that's a great way to put it. In effect, the precondition for achieving disagreement is achieving understanding.
Yeah.
I can't disagree until I understand. Yeah. And there's something wonderful about feeling like you've been understood. Even if you're understood, everybody loves it. And it's a way to communicate love and charity to another person. It fulfills another part of the gospel simply to go through that discipline of saying, I really do want to understand you. So tell me the story. Tell me the background. Tell me the experience that shaped you the way it has. And none of that is saying, therefore, you're right and I'm wrong. It's saying, I just want to understand.
Now, you, in your book, also make it clear that sometimes when you achieve understanding, or sorry, achieve disagreement, is that the phrase?
Yeah.
Sometimes a disagreement is worth splitting.
Yeah.
Sometimes it isn't a matter of taste. It's not a matter of difference of personal conviction, but we have a shared theological conviction. Sometimes now that I actually understand where you're coming from, that's not within the church. That's not Christianity.
Yeah.
So you call it not dividing the body. You actually call it discerning the body. Like, I've gone through this process, and now we've kind of discerned sort of, this isn't just a different part of the body. This is not of Jesus anymore. You give personal examples of this, how you've experienced that. So what is that? Because I feel like a lot of people hear, okay, listen, understand. We all kind of feel good about that. But sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the right move is, okay, it's time to separate. And how have you experienced that? And when do you think that is the right time, or when it isn't the right time to do that within a church context?
Yeah, there's kind of two different obvious reasons why you might need to split. And one of them, just what you said about discerning the body and say, this person is just not part of the body of Christ. And if you think about this, when you're walking through the forest, in fact, I just bought a house here in Denver that I'm trying to get ready to move into and live in. And the first thing we did was remove, literally, we know, 30 cubic yards of garden waste, i.e. trees and things like that had overgrown, weeds, all this stuff. And you're in there pruning away. In my case, not pruning shears, but this was actually like the Sawzall with one of those big blades with fangs. And I'm chopping these things off because I don't think they belong. And then I pull on it and I'm like, oh, dang, I cut the wrong blade, because suddenly all the green part came, but I didn't trace it back right. And I thought I was cutting off a dead branch. And you can imagine how often that happens when you're pruning, 30 cubic yards of waste out. Well, I think that's the way beliefs and practices come to us in the world we actually live in. So someone's at church, they're talking about something, and you're like, oh, that sounds good, that sounds bad. It's hard to trace it back to the trunk. Mm-hmm. And we're often deceived by the proximity to the branches. So if you think about this in a forest metaphor, it's very easy for two branches of two completely different trees to be far closer to each other than either of those branches is to the trunk. Because it's a 20-foot long branch, for heaven's sakes, and the two branches are touching each other, but they go back to a different tree. This happens a lot with Christians and Mormons, Christians and Jehovah's Witnesses. They say a lot of the right things, but as you begin to trace it back down and go, wait a minute, that's attached to a different trunk. And we need to know that. And if we're going to be skilled at pruning, we need to be skilled enough to know when it's like, hey, that looks like that branch, whack, off it goes. Well, watch out for that. But on the other hand, don't make that gun shy about knowing when to prune. Just go through the discipline of tracing it back to the trunk and saying, oh, you've denied that Jesus is Lord. You've denied that Jesus is God. And the trunk of Christianity is rooted in the deity of Christ, the reality of the resurrection, things like that. If you're wondering what it is, just think of the Apostles' Creed. Part of it makes a bunch of these statements, but the beauty of it is you stand up to recite that in church and you begin with the phrase, not I believe, but we believe in God the Father, maker of the heavens and the earth, and in Jesus Christ, his our Lord, who was conceived by and you go through this whole list of shared beliefs prefaced by we. And when this person says, I don't believe that, you suddenly have different trunk, different tree, no matter how close the branches were. So you want to figure that part out. The other thing that can divide people, I think, is mission issues. And this is what happened with Paul and Barnabas. Even when they divided, no one was thinking of the other one, that they weren't attached to Christ. They were disagreeing about a mission issue. One guy had abandoned them before, and Paul said, for the sake of the mission, we can't have that happening. Barnabas says, for the sake of the mission, we can't leave him behind. And the bottom line is it would appear both were right in the sense that God didn't want John Mark left behind because he needed a little bit more work. And before he's done, he's useful not only to Barnabas, but to Paul. Yeah. Paul, on the other hand, had a mission to carry forward, and he carried it forward. And I think the bottom line is the body of Christ needed both, but the missions that they were both given led them to divide. And the moral story from Paul and Barnabas is just read how Paul talks about Barnabas in the New Testament. You can't find him saying anything bad about Barnabas. And there's a ton good said about the guy, right?
Yeah.
So we're not slamming each other, but we realize the mission and call that we have just points us in different directions.
Yeah. That's great. That's great.
Although you do make the observation that in those cases, in the case of false teaching or false teachers, and in the case of true missional differences, there may be instances in which the body of Christ does divide, either intentionally because of false teaching to protect itself from false teaching, or to allow different groups of believers to pursue different missional paths. You do say, though, that your appeal is one to unity. So those instances of division would hopefully be rare. And what I really appreciate about the depiction, the explanation from Romans 14, and the way that you discuss this in the book is that by achieving disagreement, as we've mentioned, you then can make this appeal to unity, which is not sameness. It allows for disputable matters and allows for differences of conviction. And that's the image that we get in Romans 14 as well. Not one of sameness, but one in which there is really a beautiful diversity in many ways. Diversity of the people who were part of the body and a diversity of thought in these matters of conviction, and yet a pursuit of worship together and unity in Christ, unity in the fact that they were one God, they were worshiping one God, and were one family. And so that's kind of the final appeal in the book. So what would be your word to the churches to how to pursue that well?
Yeah. So one of the things is to realize, I think I use this pithy little phrase in the book, is to view your differences of conviction as a feature, not a bug in the program of the church, so to speak. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I spent 20 years as a pastor, and I discovered interesting things. Is a lot of the people who were most effective doing ministry were convinced their ministry was not only the most important one in the church, probably in the known universe, there was nothing more important than. And I had this with a person who, he had problems with addiction, and he was leading this, we called it Lion Tamers, but they were leading a ministry that, did a kind of a Christian 12-step program with addiction, things like that. And in fact, look, everybody who keeps sinning is addicted to sin. That's just what we mean by the term. So everyone should go through this. And I had another person who was this way with disability ministry, who was he was a professor who dealt with this, but he had a passion for that. And that these people are made in the image of God. Who is it more important for us to love than them? They are the most neglected, most rejected. Everyone should be part of. And I was like, I suddenly realized as a pastor, as long as they were willing to let me or the elders or whomever adjudicate the conflicts between them, I had no need to fix them of their absolute passion that this is the most important thing in the world. Because you know what? When they were that convinced, they did fantastic things in that ministry. Let somebody else negotiate the lanes, but now that you got your lane, go all out like that's the most important thing in the world. And I realized that was the key to having a bunch of effective ministries. And people who are, don't back it off, it isn't that important or whatever. I'm like, I don't think you want to fight that battle. I think you want to let them flourish, but then you have to do the things to make for mutual understanding, mutual respect, and things like that. So, to view these differences, personal convictions, not as a thing to be done away with, but a thing to say, oh, this is valuable, because that conviction gives you the energy to do a ministry that the person sitting beside you would probably never do or want to do. So I think that's a huge thing. I think another thing is kind of inviting conversation before you drop conclusions about things. So if you're talking with someone, we've talked about immigration, we've talked about just war, we've talked about sexuality things, but it's pretty easy to say, look, I'm not entirely sure about this issue, but let me tell you what I think. And if that seems a little intimidating, try this. Let me tell you what I think. I invite my students to do this, because the one thing I don't let them say is whatever. Whatever is not a moral statement, and it's not a conviction. But to say, here's what I think, you can almost feel the movement towards cultivating a personally held conviction. but at the same time, you're still inviting conversation. And so it becomes kind of a place of hospitality for differences about moral issues that you all care about. And you can state it and begin it in a way that invites that sort of hospitality or forecloses it. I've thought about this issue, and now I know this is the only way to see it. Wow, if I'm going to say something back, we're instantly in the combat mode. If I say something like, here's what I think, or here's what I think, I've invited other conversations. So cultivating those kinds of even conversational disciplines is just really, really helpful.
At the next to the last chapter, you close with a couple of verses from James 3. And I thought this was a really well-stated way to conclude that chapter and make this point near the end of the book. So I'm going to read those for us to close out our conversation today. This is from James 3, 17 and 18. And these verses say, "But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." And I think that is the heart of this book. So thank you for your work to write it, for sharing time with us today. And for those of you listening, as always, if you have questions about today's conversation or suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss on this podcast in the future, send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.